Okay, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's CPD webinar brought to you by AMS in conjunction with Chiltern Learning Trust. Once again, thank you for joining us. This is the sixth webinar in our 8-part series. And today we have Haris Shafi, who will be delivering deep dives in history. Now, as usual, just a few housekeeping rules. If you have any questions, please do ask on the group. And hopefully, inshallah, Haris will work through those. I'll interrupt him from time to time. The session is being recorded and will be uploaded onto YouTube, so you can watch it later on if you choose to. The slides that are being shared with you this afternoon will also be emailed across to you. And then finally, post-event, I'll also email you a feedback form for you to complete. So without further ado, I'll just introduce Haris Shafi. He currently works for Chorley Boys School, a really top performing school located in Luton. I think last week, for those who attended the webinar, would have heard from Nadine that it's recently had an inspection as well, and came out with outstanding features, if not outstanding overall. And Haris specializes in history as a history teacher. So without further ado, I'll welcome Haris to come forward and take it from there.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Just before we sort of properly start, I just want to get a bit of an idea of everyone's backgrounds. So if you could just in the chat sort of tell me sort of who you are, what sort of provider do you work at, what do you want to get from this session, and sort of what's the makeup of your history department or your history team at the moment. And I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Wa alaikum assalam. So yeah, essentially I just want to get an idea of sort of what is it you're trying to get from the session, and also what is the makeup of your current history team. So you've got Aliasa there saying that they're the sole member of the team. Qualified history teacher. That's an English curriculum. Sole history teacher. Excellent. So it's really interesting because we work in a team. My current team is there's 6 history teachers, and 4 of them are history specialists. So it's definitely really interesting to see that wide variety. And I'll try and adapt some of the things I'm coming up with to try and support people with smaller teams as well. Excellent. Really supportive manager of the teaching and learning team there. Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. So just to, I've got to find out a little bit about you guys. I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. So my name is Haris Shafi. I'm a teacher of history. I've held some previous roles, which are most able students coordinator, and assistant safeguarding leader. I'm currently one of the pastoral leaders at Chorley High School for Boys, as a head of house. So what you'll get from my session, hopefully, is some of the ideas and some of the things that we deliver at Chorley Boys, but also some things that you can take away and use in your current schools. Something that's worth noting is I'm not the head of history. I'm one of the history teachers, but hopefully I'll give you as rounded experience as I can. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, is well, my passions in education particularly are around social mobility. So when I first became a teacher, I had something like 1 in 80,000 free school meal students end up going on to Oxbridge, and that for me was quite shocking, quite startling. And I think what I really felt was that through education, we've got the power to sort of make change in society. And whilst I was teaching, I sort of got quite into pastoral care, trying to understand why students sometimes behave the way they do, some of the problems they have, and then moving sort of forward and learning more about history and learning about representative history is that the power of history and the power it has on our students, particularly my students that I currently teach at Twenty Boys, and the role that history has in forming our identity as well, and sort of try and move towards some element of social justice through that. And there's a picture of myself that my wife told me would be a good idea to put on there, but I think that's sort of revenge because I wasn't making dinner yesterday and I was making this PowerPoint. So that's a little bit of my background. Where is this sort of session aiming to go? So we just want to speak about what is the deep dive, and I understand some of you have been on sessions with the trust and also other sessions about deep dive, so I won't go into the sort of the particulars of that too much. But also looking at the importance of curriculum and the planning behind curriculum and how we structure a curriculum, and sort of basing that on sort of what Ofsted say is important through the quality of education and their 3 I's of intent, implement, and impact. And then looking at sort of preparing for Ofsted, how do you self-audit, what should you be looking for? And how to make sure your audit, and when you're looking at your own curriculum and what you do, you're not just looking at the surface level. It's not just a shallow swim, but it is actually that deep dive that Ofsted is looking for. And then what would happen in an Ofsted inspection? And these are inspections that we've seen in mainstream. And then hopefully the question and answers. If you have any questions, please ensure I do put them in the chat. And Brother Abdul will let me know whenever there are questions that need answering. So just starting off, so the deep dives. So essentially in 2017, Ofsted commissioned a piece of research that was looking into the study of curriculum and how they could reliably assess that curriculum. And the whole purpose of that was to look at quality of education, essentially. And from that, they came up with the early inspection framework in 2019. And this is sort of a rough way of how they look to structure that. This is from Ofsted's website. And the idea is that they're looking at your curriculum, how is it structured, does it flow? And when they come and sort of look at different schools and provision sectors, they will be looking at, in secondary, 4 to 6 subjects across year groups. In primary, they'll be looking at your reading, they'll be looking at least one foundation subject. They will normally look at maths as well. So they're the sort of things that they have already sort of signified that they would be looking out at. And throughout all of this, something that is, throughout the early inspection framework, something that's really abundantly clear is that Ofsted are really, really interested in these ideas of this, the deep dives and the 3 I's. So there's 3 parts to this. The first one is intent, and that's all about what is your curriculum. So what are you teaching? What is the justification behind that, and why are you teaching it? And then the implement was more around the pedagogy, sort of how is it being taught? How is it delivered? What problems might you face and how are you overcoming them? And then impact is based on your results, with the outcomes of your assessment. I know we make a big thing of not being an exams factory. We're an education institution. There is a big part played in the progress that your students are making, but also what are you doing to make your students well-rounded and productive members of society. I think that's so a massive part of this is the focus on curriculum, and throughout the early inspection framework, curriculum is at the center of what they're looking for. And for me, I think this is an absolutely fantastic opportunity really to showcase our subject. The subject of history has such a rich and diverse curriculum, and it's a rich tapestry. And so it's really, really powerful for us. But what they're looking for is essentially, is there a simple and clear understanding of the curriculum? Is the curriculum coherent? Is there a sort of a thread of learning throughout? So does it make sense of what you're teaching and where you're teaching it, and does it flow? And does every element, every sort of level of people understand that? Is there knowledge gaps in terms of subject knowledge, and how are schools overcoming them? Some of you mentioned that there were unqualified teachers of history. You're a sole member in a department, so it's quite hard to bridge that gap. So what supports are you being provided with, and what training are you being provided with to ensure that you can give a quality first education? And then there's this idea of cultural capital. So what ideas are you giving your students that will really help them in terms of sort of understanding curriculums, but also wider life? And then there's this idea around literacy and reading across the curriculum. Now, I know some of you were on a session with my colleague Samir Richards, who did a whole session on that. And that's because reading is such a huge part of the early inspection framework. And so, so it's sort of looking for a rigorous and sequential approach to the reading curriculum, which develops pupils' fluency, their confidence, their enjoyment in reading. And so subjects have generally focused on non-fiction reading strategies as well. So trying to bring in all of those things together. And then there's a whole thing on knowledge. So how are we embedding knowledge into students' memory? And there's a whole thing about powerful knowledge as well. So the idea with that is also looking at the research of how do students remember. So one of the key things is, how do we get students to know more, remember more, and understand more? And so the whole curriculum is there to support memory. And then looking for meaningful assessment. So when are you assessing? Why are you assessing? So leaders are understanding the limitations of assessment. Do not use it in a way that it creates unnecessary burdens for staff or learners. So it's the idea that it's not data for the sake of data. It's not assessment for the sake of assessment. You're assessing, you're understanding the needs of your student, and then you're adapting to them. And that links us into the last point there, which is teachers respond and adapt. And the idea with this is that you're checking the learner's understanding systematically, identifying any misconceptions that they have, and you're providing clear and direct feedback. And that feedback is helping students understand where they need to go to improve. Yes. Do we have any questions so far in the chat? Sorry, I haven't got access to it.
No, Harris, no questions as of yet.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So looking at sort of curriculum and looking at curriculum and history, there's sort of a lot of work that's been done about how do we sort of progress our curriculums at the moment. One of the, I've put her name wrong, sorry, it's Christine Council, that should be. Christine Council is a fantastic sort of Twitter personality, but also educator. I think she's a director of education at one of the universities. And if you ever came across the old, some of the old history textbooks, she's written quite a few of them. And this is something that she presented at the school's history project conference. And the idea was that she was going to highlight the problems with how history has traditionally been taught in schools. And this was, the idea of this is, having a look at this here, is a lot of our education, a lot of my education of history growing up looked like this. And if this is your starting point, what do you need to do to make this more reflective of today's society? Can anyone just in the chat now see any issues with it, teaching this as your history curriculum? Yes, absolutely. It's mostly British history. It's a very narrow scope of sort of world history. It's entirely European centric. So that's the first problem. We live in a globalized society, a globalized world. And this model of history is very dated, it's anachronistic, and actually it does a disservice to students because it gives them a very sort of narrow world view. And I think possibly to a greater issue is that looking at a curriculum like this, it only has sort of people of minority groups, and particularly people of black people, only feature in this sort of curriculum as either enslaved people or emancipated people. And that's phrasing from Hannah Cusworth, who's another great person to follow on Twitter for history. She does a lot of work around sort of the history and making sure history is more diverse, but she has that phrasing of is it emancipated or enslaved. And when you have that idea, it's also breeds that victim narrative. Excellent. Not many links from year 9 to year 7 to 9. So Cold War only mentioned in year 9. And that's absolutely another massive issue with something like this. And we'll come on to this as well, is about having knowledge that builds up. So that's definitely a very decent point to make. Excellent. So we're seeing, and that whole Black Lives Matter movement has been a massive, it sent shockwaves through sort of the teaching profession and curriculum, but particularly in our subject in history, it's a massive thing about how are we sort of telling those stories. So going back to the 3 I's, the curriculum intent, there's this here. So when you're mapping out what your curriculum will be, it sort of falls within your curriculum intent, and it's a huge part of what you teach, why you teach it. And there's this quote, this tweet from Heather Fern, who's the HMI leading offsetting curriculum unit, and she makes it very clear that the intent is not just one document that says this is our vision, this is what we plan to teach. The whole intent needs to breathe throughout what you teach. It needs to be in your lessons, in your extracurricular activities, in sort of the ethos of your department, or in the ethos of your department one, in the ethos of what you're doing and why you're doing it. So what is the point of you teaching history? What do you want your students to get out of it? And how are you going to help and support them to do that? Having said that, I wouldn't say don't have a curriculum intent. It'd be foolish not to have a document that lays all of that out. So when trying to work out how to frame that whole intent, Richard Kennett wrote a really good article in the Historical Association, and he's also done a speech for the Historical Association around this. And he says the way we frame our intent is more about why this, why now. So thinking about why we teach certain topics. And he's sort of come up with this sort of do's and don'ts. So he says, don't just say, oh, because it's fun, because it's engaging. I've seen people teach the Industrial Revolution, and when you said, why are you teaching the Industrial Revolution? What's the impact of that? And of course, the Industrial Revolution is very important in terms of its impact. And sort of the answer given from my head department to me was that, oh, we do a lesson on Play-Doh, and the kids really enjoy that. But actually, what is that giving the students? How does it really help them? And it's the same thing when people say, oh yeah, we teach the war because the boys enjoy the idea of war. They enjoy the blood and the gore. That's not really a good reason to be teaching history. And it's the same way where people put in social history and say, oh yeah, girls like that, so we put some social history in there. And also another thing I've seen sometimes is people say, oh, we'll put in this topic because there's lots of sources. Now history is, a lot of history is based around sources. But that's not really the right way to do it. I think it needs to be weaved into what you're doing. So things that you should be doing is picking out something that's relevant to today's society. I think in the chat someone mentioned about Black Lives Matter. Absolutely, that is absolutely relevant to today's society. So teach things that are relevant, and also pick things that you feel and your team are passionate that they need to know this. It would be remiss of us as teachers and educators not to tell them this. And then sort of, if you can, as much as you can, look into what academics are doing at the moment. There's a huge amount of sort of academic discourse and debate around different topics. And some of those topics are really good things to teach because actually you can get those relevant articles or speeches, videos of historians actually debating things. And do sort of build on knowledge from previous key stages. So if you're teaching key stage 3, have a look, make sure you know what they're doing in key stage 2. So there's that joined up thinking, and also prepare them for what's coming after. So you look at what are they going to learn in key stage 5, and look at how can you build up to that. And they're absolutely relevant things that you should be doing. The second part of this, why this, and the second part is why now. Just another point that's important to make as well. You need to balance in your curriculum the knowledge that we're giving and also the historical skills that we give. And then moving on to the why now. So the next part of this is all about why are you teaching different things in order. Someone mentioned in the chat as well, I think it's Faiza saying about that curriculum here for that Christian Council share. There's no linking between the topics. It doesn't really build on prior learning. So the why now part of this is how is your sort of curriculum mapped out? How are you building up on the knowledge that has existed beforehand? So if you're teaching the idea of sort of the Bolshevik Revolution, actually have students learn about what does it mean to be a king? What does it mean to have power? How to learn about those things. So all of those different topics should also lend information and knowledge to each other. So yeah, is there a logical flow of knowledge? Do students learn about what it means to be a king first, before the idea of democracy? And you need to be able to justify where things are taught and why different things are taught. And that also builds into that, I think the phrase is cumulative knowledge. So it's the idea that that knowledge is building. Is there also clear progression? So not just in terms of knowledge, but is there progression in terms of skills? So are you building up the skills throughout your Key Stage 3 curriculum up until GCSE? Is that happening? Are you adding that value? And for all over Twitter, there are these curriculum intent sort of mapping things that you can see here. So here's one from Stevenson Memorial History Curriculum. So that's their roadmap of what they teach, why they teach it. And it's a really good document, and lots of places have this. R1 is down here, and it works slightly differently. So down here we've got a sorry about that. Down here we've got a curriculum map, and ours works on Google Drive, and we're constantly updating it. And that's a really important point as well, because your curriculum doesn't need to be perfect, but there needs to be a plan in place, and there needs to be a system of review, and it also needs to be right for your context. I'm just having a look in the chat. It says, what do you do if your school is reliant on specific resources that are often Eurocentric? So high turnover of staff means there needs to be a set curriculum in a place that can be taught by everyone. Brilliant question. And that is a problem. You know, if you go on TES or something like that, the resources are generally very Eurocentric, but there are also huge amounts of resources. If you go on Twitter, Hannah Cusworth is a great person to follow. She's got a whole unit of work on Black people's experience in Britain. I think it's based on the book Putting the Black in the Union Jack. So yeah, Twitter is your friend. There are so many people out there who are doing amazing things, and they are sharing them, and they're sharing them often for free. I know we've tapped into that, but also speak to people. There are history teachers are generally quite nice people. There's Facebook groups where there's Hannah Cusworth on Twitter, but there's a whole series of people on Twitter sharing loads of stuff. There's also on Facebook, there's an AQA Facebook group that I've used. There's a Key Stage 3 history group. There's a history group for, I think it's UK history teachers. So all those things, and people are sharing their whole Google Drive on that. So tap into them, and also build those connections with other departments. If you've got other schools, and particularly if you've got schools that you know are doing something good, reach out and ask them to share things. And generally speaking, I think a lot of people either will share their resources or support you into building your own, which are similar. And I know that can be time, you have to invest time into that. If you have any other questions, please do just write them into. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so the EdXL teachers group is another one as well. I think there's one usually for each exam board. And there's this whole sort of debate about making your curriculum inclusive. So should your curriculum be inclusive? Just in the chat, is it worth doing? Do we need to do it? Or is it just a waste of time? So just in the chat, does the curriculum need to be inclusive? And why? Absolutely, to give a sense of identity and belonging to all pupils. Definitely. So that's a good point. So I'm going to sort of fire another question back at you. If you taught in a school that was 95% white British or 98% white British, does the curriculum then need to be inclusive? Okay, yes, even more so. So I'm going to start maybe picking on people. Samira, why do you think it needs to be more inclusive in a school that's predominantly sort of white? Yeah, excellent. So to teach tolerance, mutual respect, it's not about just your students and their backgrounds. Promote equality and tolerance amongst young people. Excellent. I think it's also about society. You know, I think I read somewhere that in January of 2019, 32 or 33% of primary age school kids were from a minority background or a diverse background. So if we prepare all of our students for a society that's diverse, including students that may not live in diverse areas, it means that we can have that social cohesion as well in society. Excellent. Teaching the British Empire, but also include partition and independence to promote tolerance. Absolutely. There was a Guardian article that came out on the 1st of December, which basically said that Amanda Spillman said that actually we shouldn't be making the curriculum more diverse. And the particular comment that she made was around sort of climate change. So we shouldn't be teaching it from a moral point of view. We should be teaching it from a scientific point of view. But that's been blown up into her saying we shouldn't make the curriculum more diverse. But there is a warning in that I will heed as well, because it says that we also need to be sure that we're teaching children things that remain grounded in facts. We shouldn't be just finding ways to, push our own political agenda or opinion. Excellent. I've still just seen some more comments in the chat, so thank you to everyone that's contributing. So whilst we shouldn't be pushing our own sort of political opinions, we definitely do have a social responsibility as historians, and we have a historical responsibility to show students and a real reflective history, and also try and teach history in a way that really just does challenge misconceptions. So there's ideas of this narrow history that's actually doing students a disservice. History in school this country is political when we leave out Britain's part in the world. Definitely. And then just sort of moving away from that a little bit, just to my own experience, there's this TV show that some of you might be familiar with. It's a Drilis Ertugrul, so it's a Turkish show about Ertugrul Gazi, the father of Osman, who's the first or the founder of the Ottoman Empire. And being in a school that, like ours, is predominantly Muslim, I've seen the power of something like this with our students. The number of students that have come to us so much more enthusiastic about history, so much more engaged and asking lots of questions. That's exactly what we want as teachers. I had a student that can be challenging at times. He avoids homework. He's that sort of student. And he's watched this TV show and he loves it so much. He's created a whole PowerPoint presentation in his own time to come and show me how much he knows about the Ottoman Empire. And there's two parts of that. There's one part of using film to engage students, but for him, I think it's a greater thing. I think, and particularly for Muslim students, we don't have something or in media, we're often portrayed in a way that we can't be proud of. And here we have a TV show that actually promotes sort of Muslim identity as a positive thing in the world. And it brings us back to this idea of, having a society that's diverse, but also it's inclusive. Because once you get that inclusivity, then people have a sense of belonging. And I think for our boys, that's so important. And for our girls, I'm just saying boys because our school is an all boys school. So just talk to you a little bit about that, about our context. So when we're thinking about our curriculum intent, and when you're thinking about your curriculum intent, you really need to think about your context. I think a lot of Muslim schools, that will be part of your context that you're working towards. And so we had a look at this. This is our school context. So it's a single-sex boys' school. It's an average-sized academy with around 1,200 pupils. It's in a fairly deprived area. We've got 33% pupil premium, 86% EAL students. And the majority of students are Muslim from Pakistani and much smaller to Bengali backgrounds. And with it, we see the importance of history and the importance of identity. And we're trying to build a curriculum that's inclusive. One of my colleagues, did a bit of research into this, and she said, this is what she's sort of written for me. It says, the Historical Association lists 6 principles on achieving a successful and inclusive curriculum, which are that history should be chosen to reflect diversity where possible. Historical stereotyping should be avoided of individuals. The choice of source material should be diverse where appropriate. Sources should be chosen from a diverse range of media, which is accessible to all. That the vocabulary teachers use in their day-to-day practice should be carefully considered, and that assumptions shouldn't be made about the backgrounds of learners. So they're the 6 main things. And yet, despite these principles, curriculums have sometimes veered away from reflecting truly inclusive experiences. And so having those truly inclusive experiences narrated within the history curriculum is specifically important in addressing one of the core purposes of history education within schools, which is to try and connect human experiences with that of the past, so that we can understand similarities, differences, obstacles that others have faced, and also it makes us empathetic to those obstacles in today's society. And then just focusing on that idea of similarity, we looked in some research in the context of Trinity High School for Boys. And there's a think tank called Curriculum for Cohesion, which in 2012 published a study, and it looked at the disengagement of Muslim boys within the history curriculum in particular. Its findings were pretty resolute. It said 49% of Muslim boys said their history education would have been better if they also had learnt about the history of Islam. The findings also stated that history as a tool for civil success and knowledge is particularly important for young boys, and particularly young Muslim boys. The absence of an integrated history led to history education being seen as meaningless for a lot of those students. And research by Wilkinson et al. Further suggested that the integration of powerful knowledge to do with the Islamic Golden Age would begin to provide all children in English schools as a history education that enables them to engage knowledgeably with themselves, their classmates, their country, and the rest of the world. So basically what that's saying is that it would help those students, but also their non-Muslim counterparts, it would help them as well. And looking at the Islamic Golden Age would be a good historical tool to do that. Someone was asking about this earlier about the resources. Another resource that just comes to my mind is BBC Teach actually has a series of videos on different topics on YouTube. And one of them is on the Islamic Golden Age. I think there's a series of short videos on that.
Harris, could I just interrupt you with a quick question?
Cool.
It's just on the chat, and I'm just going to paraphrase. Somebody was asking, with the vast majority of our schools being independent schools, and we don't need to follow the national curriculum as such, we have the flexibility to effectively teach what we choose to, albeit that we can explain the rationale and the reasoning, as you explained earlier on, through the 3 I's. So somebody was asking the question as to whether or not we could teach about the companions and use that as a basis about history, because in essence, that could be one of the main attractions for somebody to send their child to a Muslim school. But I'm not going to ask you to necessarily answer the question with regards to what the do's and don'ts of independent schooling is, because I don't expect you to know the answer to it. But what would be your response with regards to having a history curriculum which is predominantly centered around the prophets and the companions, but maybe doesn't necessarily it's not inclusive in the sense that it doesn't include other types of history?
Yeah, I can't. I wouldn't speak solely on independent schools, but something that Ofsted do argue for. Firstly, on the Islamic history side, I will come to that in my next slide, hopefully. But in terms of, if you're solely Islamic history, I think there would be a problem, because history should be broad. They ask for a broad and balanced curriculum, so it shows other bits of history as well. But actually, no. In terms of teaching a history that's talks about the impact of Islam, well, we do it, and it's the first thing we teach when students come into year 7. So so when they come in year 7, this is what we teach, and we do it from a sort of historical point of view. It's not a religious sort of lesson. It's not a sort of faith lesson. It's just looking from just an academic point of view. And it's based around an inquiry question. It's based around historical skills. But the topics that we look at we look at the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's life. We look at the caliphs, the spread of Islam. We look at sort of the golden age of Islam in sort of Baghdad. And then we also look at the Crusades, partly because we used to teach Crusades, and the boys would ask us, okay, we've learned about that, but what about the Muslims? And we would teach it from a very Eurocentric point of view. And now we try and teach it from a more balanced point of view. So what were the Crusades to the Muslims? What were they to also the Christians? And it's sort of getting that balance right. So yeah, no, it's a really good question. I don't know about teaching the lives of the prophets from Prophet Adam to Muhammad. I'm not sure if you could just do that as one, because I think also you need to have sort of historical skills. You're also teaching them all of those things as well. Does that sort of answer that question?
Please carry on, Harrison. I guess if there's any further questions around that from the person who asked it, they can ask on the chat or comment on the chat.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So yeah, this is the first thing we teach. And the reason that we teach it first is because it builds on prior learning and prior knowledge. So a lot of our boys come in with some information and some knowledge about this, not from junior school necessarily, but from their home lives. So it is tying into that quite nicely. And it's quite important for the children to have that, and it gives them that grounding. We then sort of move on from that to look at the Norman conquest, and here we're looking at the key historical skills, continuity and change, and our sort of overarching inquiry question is all about how does England change as a result of the Norman conquest. This is kind of like a classic English history lesson, essentially, in a series of lessons. But what we do slightly differently is we compare the Norman conquest with society in Anglo-Saxon England. So we look at, because they're roughly around the same sort of age, so what is going on in these two sort of empires. And you see that continuity, you see that change, you see that difference. And it also links to Key Stage 2 learning, because a lot of students learn about Anglo-Saxon Britain in Key Stage 2 as well. Yeah, so we teach just that question there is do you teach the Islamic unit prior to the Norman unit? Yeah, we do. At the moment, that's the way we've got it. And that's something else on curriculum that I'm going to come to later. Is it's not necessarily just doing it chronologically. It's doing it thematically. It's doing it in a way that works. And for us, it works because it really engages the boys, it engages the parents, it builds on their prior learning, and it's a nice introduction to high school as well, because it gives them some familiarity as well. And so yeah, with this, we're just looking at key concepts as well, which will build up throughout Key Stage 3 later on. And then we sort of move on and we look at this unit about Tudor queens. Now, sort of the classic history teaching is looking at Henry VIII, looking at Henry had lots of wives, divorced, beheaded, survived. We all remember the sort of the rhyme from primary school. And we sort of try to flip this on its head to try and look at it from a different perspective or a different lens. So we look at the influence of Tudor queens. So we look at Anne Boleyn and her marriage to Henry and how that coincides with the breaking of the English crown and the Church of Rome. We look at Mary I and how she then turns England back into a Catholic country, and then we look at the role of Mary I and also Mary Queen of the Scots, and that helps us sort of frame this inquiry question of like, how did Tudor queens influence religion in England? And there's a number of reasons we did this, but namely our curriculum didn't have enough female stories in it, and an all-boys school was something we felt should change it. And also it's a story that is actually really important. A lot of people have lots of misconceptions about women and power in England. They have this idea that, you know, firstly, England was one of the first countries to give women the vote. Actually, we only gave women the vote on equal terms in 1928. And they also perpetuates this idea that women before that were just subordinate to men. And it shows that that's not one of the narratives that our boys are actually learning. Yeah, actually, so far the boys are they have, and we're doing it with year 7s, but they are absolutely engaged with this topic, and I think it's quite easy to do. It's just taking, you know, a lot of the stuff, the content we're teaching is similar. We're just framing the idea in a different way. But yeah, and I think that's the other thing with curriculum. It doesn't have to be onerous. You don't have to do huge amounts to change it. You know, just looking at small things that you can do to try and make it more reflective, and also doing it for a reason, knowing what you're doing and why you're doing it is really important. We then look at how did power and authority change between 1200 and 1700. So this is our power and the people model, and it's quite a thematic, where it's different to the others. It's not running chronologically, it runs across time. And we built into the curriculum as a result of constructive feedback we received actually on a review we had. So we had a review, and we had a lot of our year 7 was looking at Elizabeth and is repeating the topic that we did at GCSE. And we had a sort of quality assurance review by an Ofsted inspector. And they came in and she said, actually, you're repeating the topics and that's not good. You're wasting curriculum time. So we sort of brought this in to cover for that. And so at Key Stage 4, we cover medicine through time. And so we decided to introduce a thematic unit on power and the people in year 7, and also one in year 8 on migration. And within this, we did that sort of for 2 reasons actually. One is that if it's a GCSE topic that we're simplifying, there's lots of resources out there, so it's easier. And so within this unit, students to really look at the growth of democracy or democratic principles in Britain, and the process of who controls power and how it's wielded, how it changes over time. And so the course really examines, like, looks at the Magna Carta, the Oxford Provisions, the impact that Simon de Montfort made, the Peasants' Revolt, and eventually the English Civil War. So rather than doing those as sort of standalone units, we look at them as a theme, because they're all really important things to learn about. You know, the English Civil War and Oliver Cromwell is something that's so important to know about. And so we look at it in that sort of more thematic way. And that sort of helps challenge something that has been termed a democratic deficit. So in schools, students don't know about the importance of democracy. This is a way of challenging that, and it ties into our work around British values. However you might feel about the term British values, but it makes it prominent in school. And you know, as a school and as a department, we are encouraged to sort of put that into what we do. But we're doing it for the right reasons and in the right ways. So it's looking at how citizens can go on to make a positive difference in society, and it looks at the shift from divine right of kings to parliamentary government, which is sort of really important for students to get that awareness around the context of democratic institutions, and also about how government works today. Are there any topics that should be prioritized, or can it be entirely open? I think on that question, I think it's a balance. It's not curriculum for sake of curriculum. It's, you need to know why you're doing it. You need to be able to justify that. In addition, how much weight should be? Sorry, there's lots of questions coming in at once. I just come back to this. In addition, how much weight should we put on topics that are cross-curricular? For example, should we teach parallel curriculum? Let's be penalised if we don't do this. I don't think you'd be penalised if you don't link it directly with citizenship, but there is an expectation around having British values, having a cultural capital. So if you don't have those things in it, you would be penalised, I imagine, because that is an expectation in the early inspection framework. It ties into that sort of character education as well. So what is really important to study all these of Queen Henry V, Muslim schools choose hundreds of years ago as every single aspect, looking at quality of education as impact. If in our schools we scrap all these books and adopt some key Islamic history books, will we fail Ofsted? Why? How do we use the package? I'll be entirely honest with Brother Ali Hassan. That is something I'll have to come back to you on. I will have to, I'll look at that in a bit more detail. In terms of stopping teaching history, there was a thing that came in a couple of years ago about EBAC subjects. So, and it might be different in the independent sector. In the state sector, we would be penalised if we didn't teach history or geography after year 9. So I'm not sure how that would work in the independent sector, but definitely in the state, it is an expectation, and schools are penalised for not. Great question about incorporating exam skills. Yeah, so if we have a look at the assessments, they are all based on GCSE exam skills. Now that's something that we've introduced at the moment. We're just going to review that and see how it goes, because some of the research and some of the guidance says that you shouldn't do that, whereas other parts are saying actually that's fine, you can do that, you're building up those skills. So it's not, you're not just teaching to the exam. So we are, and at the moment our assessments are based around GCSE exam questions. There is a slight problem with that because different exam boards mean different things in some questions. So for example, the idea of historical significance for AQA, if you answered that in the exact same way for EdXL, they'd mark it slightly differently. And we aren't penalising students for that. We're just keeping historical significance in Key Stage 3 quite broad. And when they get to Key Stage 4, say, actually, this exam board is actually meaning this by historical significance, if that kind of makes sense. And that's just something we have to do to adapt to exam boards sometimes. If I just keep rolling with it, so the next thing that we look at is looking at why does West Africa become globalized in the 1300s, and what are the consequences of that globalization. So it sort of just shows how connected our world is and how connected the world was in the early modern period. So whilst Europe was plagued with war and factionalism during the 14th century, West Africa represented a flourishing entity of various kingdoms, which were externally or internally connected with traders in the Middle East. The focus on asking why these kingdoms were globalized in the 14th century targets a misconception that students are at risk of falling into, where if they don't study Africa before the slave trade. And it's that idea of Africa existing as a closed continent and also an uncivilized place before sort of Western and European invaders went there. Sorry, invaders is probably quite a charged word. I'd probably should use something more neutral. So the whole inquiry around this is sort of set to show Western Africa as actually quite a cosmopolitan global kingdoms, which were rife in migration, which had huge amounts of gold trade. And actually there was a lot of cultural exchange as well, especially through religion. And there's some really good literature by Toby Green on this. And he's sort of written a A-level exam spec on this, and he's on various free webinars I've seen online where he's sort of talking about this as well. So if you look up the A-level topic on West African kingdoms, that's basically what we based ours around, but obviously much more simplified. Yeah, that's Toby Green. And so, yeah, and this is a man I knew very little about, to be honest, Mansa Musa, and he was said to be the richest man that ever lived. And when he went on pilgrimage, went on to Hajj, he spent huge amounts of money. And there's tales of him going to Cairo and spending so much gold that it completely, destabilized the currency and economy there. But at the same time, what was going on in Europe, and building those parallels to students opens their minds. And it opens their minds because actually in history, there's a narrative around Africa being sort of very backwards, and particularly that imperialist, orientalist view of history, where, it's sort of, the people from Europe, white Christians, went to Africa to civilize people. And it sort of challenges that, actually, because, you had universities, you had hospitals in these places, while people in this country, were living in huts. And so it sort of challenges that idea. And then we sort of move on to the Black British experience. And again, using that slave or enslaved or emancipated, we thought it was really important to show a diverse history and include the Black British experience. So this is a new unit of work, and we actually came up with the idea before Black Lives Matter, but it actually really had a bit more work done on it after that. And it follows on really nicely from the West African kingdoms, because it looks at slavery in 3 lessons, but it moves on to the Black British experience. And looking at Black people in Britain before the English came to Britain, so Black Romans, Black Tudors, looking at Windrush, looking at the Bristol bus boycotts, the Notting Hill riot, the Equality Act, Race Relations Act. And really, it's bad historical teaching to not include these things. So it's a really nice piece of work to end our year on, and hopefully our boys will build those links with what happened in this year with the Black Lives Matter protests as well, and hopefully it will have a lasting impact on them. And then we look at the Mughal Empire in the start of year 8, and this is our second year teaching it. And again, it's important for our boys because of their background, but it's important for history. This is an empire that in 1700 had the world's largest economy, with between 25 and 28% of global industrial output, and 27% of the world's GDP. And it's been a real sort of journey for us teaching this, because it's stuff that we didn't know about. And I being of Pakistani heritage, knew very little about the Mughal Empire. But it was such a rich empire with lots of different cultures, religions, and connections with the rest of the world. And the focus of our inquiry is to assess which of the Mughal emperors were most effective rulers between 1526 and 1707. And it allows us to sort of build up themes and threads around military conquest, sort of the economic, cultural, and religious and economic advances. And we also look at some of the religious tolerance shown by Muslim Mughal rulers over their subjects who are mostly Hindu, but also consist of many Sikhs. We look at sort of Emperor Akbar and the way he would hold weekly theological debates where he'd invite people from all faiths, Muslim, Hindus, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians. The fact that actually Jahangir had 3 of his nephews baptized by Jesuit priests, and actually the fact that Mughal bloodlines were joined with Hindu families as well. And then we also look at the reign of Aurangzeb, who imposed quite a strict Muslim rule, but also then went and destroyed many Hindu temples, bringing back jizya tax and even boiling some Sikhs alive. And it sort of allows us in a number of ways to create parallels at the same sort of similar time of what was going on in Europe. So by and large, the Mughal Empire was far more tolerant than someone like Mary I, who was around the similar sort of time period. And by drawing those parallels, it gives us that sense of world history and also chronology. And so, yeah, I think for us as well, it's sort of building up that idea around that. So, I've got some questions. I'm just going to have a look at. 2010, which made current. Okay, so question on how much time we give to Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. So we have 2 lessons a week on Key Stage 3, and we have 3 lessons in Key Stage 4 at the moment. But since COVID has happened, we've put in an extra lesson after school for Key Stage 4, so they actually get for year 11 only, and so they get 4 hours a week of history. That's 1 lesson, year 7 to 9, 2 lessons, 10 to 11. Okay, yeah, so ours is 2 lessons, Key Stage 3, year 9 and 10 get 3 lessons, and then year 11 get 4 lessons. We do 2 lessons of 50 minutes each, so I imagine it's similar, isn't it? I think. And then we look at the British Empire, looking at Empire, and this sort of builds on the knowledge that existed in the other 2 units as well, and that really drives that forward. Just open the chat again. Right. So yeah, I'm going to go through this a bit quicker now. But yeah, we look at this, and this works really well because it builds on a lot of the prior information in the Mughal unit, but also in the West African civilization unit. And it sort of really helps students understand, why did Britain want an empire? How did it benefit Britain? And what was the impact on those countries that were taken as an empire? And we sort of have a look at that question of, to what extent was the British Empire a force for good? And then we look at some exam things and that. We also look at a unit on World War I and look at the experience of different people. So we look at the causes of World War I, the political history there, but also the social history in terms of, what was the experience of people who were not European? What was the experience of women during this time? What was actually the experience of the war in Germany and the German sort of home front? So we always look at the sort of home front from a British and English point of view, but we try to look at it from a German perspective as well, and then we try and get that understanding of and that empathy of these were human beings as well, which I think sometimes isn't really done in some of our feeder schools. Right, and then we are going to look at, and these units aren't, so looking at the Second World War, to what extent was Churchill the reason they won, but also looking, and then also the second part of that unit is looking at what was Jewish people's experience of the Holocaust, and that's continued there. And then something that we're planning to do for the summer is looking at, so how far was the Holocaust responsible for the creation of Israel? How does the Arab-Israeli relations deteriorate as a result of the creation of Israel? And looking at that, when that unit isn't currently planned, but it's something that we're currently working on. And it's one of those things that we're going to try and get some work from Parallel Histories, which is another organisation that offers sort of resources, and they do free seminars and webinars. And I've been on some of their webinars, and they're quite powerful. And this unit will be really important and interesting for us, I think, because our boys, almost entirely Pakistani background, and they will almost all come into this seeing it as they have a side in this conflict. And we've spoken to Parallel Histories about this, and they said, this is a unit that it would be impossible to teach without bias. So whichever narrative you choose, there is a bias. And the best way to teach this would be to teach both sides. Teach the Israeli perspective, teach the Palestinian perspective, allow the students to make their own sort of mind up about it. And I think I think as teachers, that's something we find quite difficult, because the kids want you to tell them what was right, what was wrong, and it's allowing them to formulate their own opinions. I think that's quite powerful. And then this unit as well, we're currently working on this, is the migration unit. So looking at migration as a theme, looking at different groups that come to England, maybe looking at a local study on this, looking at who's come to our town. So we're in Luton. There's a oral history project called Luton Voices from about 10 or 12 years ago, where people have spoken about, they interviewed different people about when they moved to Luton. And I only know about that because my dad was interviewed and my granddad were interviewed about when they came to Luton. But there are, you know, a whole series of books that maybe we are looking at possibly getting students to create their own sort of oral history and looking at the purpose of oral history. Excellent. We've got Alyasa, who's a researcher of parallel histories, and also recommends them. So yeah, definitely check them out. Thank you, Alyasa. So some potential challenges. So we teach at the moment a 3-year GCSE, a 3-year Key Stage 3, and so year 7, 8, and 9. No, sorry, let me get that right in my head. We teach a 3-year GCSE. So year 7 and 8 is Key Stage 3, and then 9, 10, and 11 is Key Stage 4. And that is something that actually in the early inspection framework, it says you don't get students to choose any earlier than they do. So they don't specifically say you can only do 3 years in Key Stage 3, but they encourage it. And the whole point of this, when they came to us, our argument was, look, we are still giving them a broad and balanced curriculum, and there's a number of ways you can do this. And so a lot of that is through our extracurricular stuff, but also as a result of our homework. And I just want to show you this. It's by Will Bailey Watson, and he came up with the idea, and other people have added theirs. And these are homeworks that you can set, and they're called Meanwhile Elsewhere. And so it's like when we'd be teaching about King John ruling England, their homework would be to research the Mongol Empire. And there's some links down here about, you know, where they can find this information. Write down some of the information here, and so sort of try and build that up. I'm just gonna show you, or try and show you, so my technological skills are tested. Can everyone's just Brother Abdul, if you can tell me, can you see the Google slide?
Yes, we can see Google website.
Excellent. So if you just type in Meanwhile Elsewhere, it's the top one there. There's a whole series of these. So there's things that happen sort of if you're teaching pre-1066, if you're learning about any of these things, the Meanwhile Elsewheres are already done for these different things. So if you're teaching about the Vikings, there's a link here about the Abbasid Caliphate, and then there's a sheet on that. And those are already planned and made for you there, up there, and they're freely available, and there's some for different topics. And you just click on those, and these are all the ones that have been done. There's some in the early modern period. There, and then there's these other ones that are meanwhile nearby. So you look at where you're studying, and then look at what's happening nearby. And if you're maybe near some of those places, you can look at some of the history that happens near you. But they're just sort of ideas of how you can show a broad and balanced curriculum, even though you've got a shorter Key Stage 3. And so having watched that, you might think, oh, look, I need to change my curriculum. I need to, do this, I need to do that. And actually, no, you don't stop. And just pause, think about if you are thinking about redesigning your curriculum, what are the parameters you need to work in? What are the plans for your whole school curriculum? Talk to the different stakeholders. There'll be your wider colleagues, people in the school, your community, parents, students. What do they want done in their curriculum? What would they want to learn about? And then sort of make your plan to stay connected to other people. That stay connected is really important. There's so many resources out there that you won't be able to do this by yourself, and it makes it so easy because people are giving things away. And also to reach out to the experts, find the people who are doing it. There's organizations, the Historical Association is offering lots of webinars. There's different groups helping you with this. That just makes that whole process a lot easier. And sort of with that plan, also have an idea of where you're going with it. What is your idea? But yeah, so just overall on your curriculum intent, things to consider. And I won't go through all of these, but just these ideas of, is your curriculum broad and balanced enough? How are you developing that cultural and British values? This is from the Historical Association. I've just added 2 points onto it. But there are things that, you could and should be considering with history. And then the next part, so the first that was all about intent. This is all about implementation. So this is about how are you teaching it, why are you teaching it the way you are. And it's all around pedagogy. Now, some of you might have seen this pyramid before, and it's the methods of training and retention rates. And it's something that I saw. I was told that this is how you teach kids, and this is how they remember what you teach them. And our school has employed a research lead. He's one of our associate SLTs, and he looks at a lot of the research. And he said, well, actually, a lot of this has actually now been debunked, and actually, that's not accurate. And so just be aware of things. Just be aware of what you're doing and how you're doing it. And one of the big problems for teaching history has always been sort of knowledge. How do we get students to retain that much knowledge? And this part's sort of looking at the idea of knowledge as generative. So the more you have, the more you can hold on to. The more base knowledge you have about something, the more it will help you learn about other things. And I think in the early inspection framework, it uses the phrase schema. And that's the idea of knowledge being a web. So if you have different ideas, you know about different things, they all link together in the end. And history is definitely a subject that lends itself to that a lot. But yeah, something that the biggest problem I found is that students forget. You have so much content for them to cover, particularly for us as well, working with a 3-year GCSE. But even if you have a 2-year GCSE, there's so much for them to know that they just forget it unless you keep revisiting it. And this is Herman Ebbinghaus was I think he was about over 100 years ago, but he was a psychologist, and he came up with this idea of the forgetting curve. And so the idea is that, if you remember this sort of time, so how many minutes after you learn something, and each of these interventions is you sort of revisiting it or going over it again. And the idea was that you had to go over something a number of times before you can remember it. And that's been sort of built up by the idea of this sort of working memory and long-term memory. Is I think called cognitive load theory. And the idea is that if you have any information that's coming in, that goes into your sensory information. It's what you're reading, what you're hearing. And most of the time, that is just then forgotten. Your brain takes in a lot of that. Then some things get pushed into your working memory. And if you keep going over rehearsing them, they can get pushed into your long-term memory. But if not, they get forgotten. And the idea is you need to find ways to retrieve information, get students to retrieve information, finding new ways for them to revise, and sort of better ways for them to revise. And so this is something from Greg Thornton Teach. So Mr. Thornton Teach, he's on Twitter as well. He's got a website with loads of great resources. And this is sort of like a breakdown of how do you revise in history. And we sort of pass this on to the students and how to make notes and things. This one's a little bit old actually, so it's just a few years old. So there's more updated versions of things like this. And something else Mr. Thornton Teach started off as these history how-tos. If you just type in history how-to on Google, they'll come up, and he's got sort of a sort of knowledge organizer or a sheet with some good tips and different historical strategies. And something we use a lot of is this sort of retrieval practice. Oh, I've got a question. Excellent. So the idea of this is the first thing that we do a lot of, and it's that idea of just revisiting things to help you remember them. So, and helping students remember them. So it has a little bit of, over here on all of them, it has a little bit of sort of what's the pedagogy, what's the academic research behind what you're being asked to do. It's quite brief and it's very accessible. Then there's sort of a brief way of putting things in place, do's and don'ts, and then in the history classroom, so find and fix. So these are different ideas of things students can do to retrieve information. This is something else that we have done is the Lightning method about it's with flashcards. There's a video clip on it which we might come to at the end, but the idea in general is that students get flashcards and they put out 5 boxes, and each day, or actually you space it out over time, so you might do one and you might wait a few weeks, do another one, wait a few more weeks, do another one. And the idea is that any flashcards that students get correct, they move along in the box, and any they get wrong, they move back to the start. And the idea is that by the time they get all of their cards in the box, that will be embedded in their knowledge. To do this, we first started off with some cards from Collins, but then we found that they weren't that great, so we made our own. So we just put a question, and on the other side we put some information the students needed to know. And these are easily differentiated as well, so you can just put less information or more information, or target it to the exam. You could also, something that we found for GCSE is students don't remember how to answer particular questions, so I've created flashcards on how to answer a question 1 on Germany, which is always interpretation, so 1, 2, and 3. So we'll have cards that sort of go over that as well. So some of them are knowledge, but some of them are other skills, and also they are the exam structure, essentially, the mark scheme structure. Excellent. And so some things that we do, okay. So some of the other things we do here is retrieval in lessons. So we do a number of things. We start all of our starters, not all, but most of our starters in lessons are recaps of previous learning. So they're something that forces students to retrieve what they've previously learned, embedding that in their long-term knowledge. And then we do a lot of like low stakes quizzing. So the idea with this is that we don't tell students how many marks they get. It's not, how many they get right isn't the focus of it. The focus is what do they get wrong and how do they improve it. And what they'll do is they'll write in one color what they think, and if there's any correction, they do them in a different color so they stand out. Something that we've come and created out of the coronavirus pandemic is that with students working at home, we started using Google Forms a lot more. And now we just use them. So every week we set one of these retrieval quizzes online. They're self-marking, so they're a bit of work when you first make them. They're multiple choice, but once you've made them, there's no marking because you just select the right answer and the students can see where they got them wrong. I'm sure that there are sort of things that are sold out there and organizations that make these, but if you sit down with a textbook, it'll take a few hours. So if you can put in the time, and it is an effective way, and you can target it to what your students definitely need. So we've got one of these sort of created for every 3 lessons that the students learn across Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. And I think that's the benefit of having sort of a large team, because you can divide out the work. But if you're in a smaller team, it's finding ways to make that easier. So trying to make, one of the things you could do is get the students to come up with the questions. Or you could set this as a homework task of create a quiz on. And it's quite simple. If you just go into Google Forms, you can create sort of a multiple choice quiz. And I'm quite technologically challenged, and I've managed to work it out, so the kids will definitely know how to do it. And then from this, we also created these retrieval booklets. And the idea with this is that each of these is essentially a lesson that students have learnt about. We have some keywords to help them remember, and we have some images for dual coding. And the idea is that the first time the students do this, they'll fill in as much as they can from that, and then we'll put on the board some answers that they fill in a different color. Then they'll wait maybe 3 or 4 weeks. They will do it again, but they will do it without the images to support them. And then they might wait a few more weeks, and they will do it again without the keywords. And then there's the answers. And what we've found is even lower ability boys will write something, because the first time they do it, they've got these keywords, and that's just really important. A lot of our boys that find history difficult just struggle with low self-esteem, and I found with even sort of bottom set boys, they will engage with this and be able to write something, and that just boosts their confidence for next time, and it helps them retain that information. Another one of these sort of revision tools is knowledge organizers. So again, there's some research there, some information there. I'm not going to go through it, but they will be shared out. And again, there's more of these online, so 10-minute knowledge quiz as well. And so when we talk about building in sort of knowledge, we also need to look at vocabulary. So actually, should we stop there for any questions so far?
Thanks so far, Harris. You've answered most of the questions, if not all. If there's any further questions, if anybody could post on the group chat.
Okay, I think we're good. And if you have any, just write them. So one of the ideas of it was this cumulative knowledge. So it's building up knowledge over time. So along with that is sort of building up vocabulary over time. So it's cumulative vocabulary. And so in the education inspection framework, a massive part of it is reading. And it is really important. I remember a few years ago, I had some students who were answering a GCSE paper. And the question was something like, how did prosperity in Elizabethan England result in new types of houses? And because some of the boys didn't know what the word prosperity meant, they couldn't access the curriculum. And it's quite sad, because I think the average age for GCSE papers is around, the reading age is 16 years, whereas some newspapers I think is about 8 years. So that's a bit of a disparity. So it's really important for us to give students the vocabulary to do what they need to do. So if there's this sort of thing about tiered vocabulary, so the tier 1 is sort of everyday words that students might use, this, the, and. Tier 2 are sort of robust academic words that they're likely to cover across topics and content areas. So things like monarchy, republic, and then there's specific words. So for us in history, there might be Anglo-Saxon, the Fjord, a Housecarl. In Germany, you might look at Anschluss, or you might look at Lebensraum. So they're words that are specifically with the topic. And it's about specifically dedicating time to teaching children these words, because without them, with that presumption that they know them, we are doing them again a disservice. These are some key terms from primary history, which is part of the historical association, with some words that students should probably know by the end of sort of key stage 2, which will help them in key stage 3. How can questions respond high level, given how can we prepare students to respond to a high level, given they only have an hour of the paper? I think just by practice. It's difficult, but I think it's practice, and it's also teaching them how to structure. Something we found really effective, and we're trying to do more of, is co-constructing with students. So sometimes I've been guilty of this, presuming that students know how to write a paragraph, know how to answer a question. So it's a case of if you've got a visualizer, using a visualizer. If you haven't, I'm a fan of the whiteboard, so just writing on there, creating an answer with them, getting them to come up with the bit, and you can see that way the gaps in their knowledge, and they can see your thought process in how you create those answers and the level of detail that might be needed. We don't really, just to that question about spelling, we don't really test, and maybe that's something we should be doing. We don't really test spelling of the key terms, but we do need to do more to teach those key terms. So that might be something that we look at in more detail. So there's different ways you can do this, and there's loads of ideas on how you teach this on Teach It History. It is a paid subscription site, but they have a few articles on this, and that's where I got this sort of word bank from. And it's the idea of different ways you can teach it. So giving students the content, the concept, and then getting them to fold it, and then testing them on those words, and also just giving them the key terms there. Something that you might have seen from my colleague Samir, he's developed this awesome reading list for students, and they run alongside the curriculum. So it's building into that idea of reading and the importance of reading, and they've been shared with students. The list have been shared electronically. We've got them out and around our department as well, and it's helpful for the boys, but it's also helpful for us as staff. I teach Elizabethan England, probably my weakest topic, and I'm currently reading Wolf Hall, which is all about Thomas Cromwell as an advisor to Henry VIII, and it's looking at his rise and fall. So I haven't finished it, so no spoilers in the chat. But there's also Ian Mortimer's book there about Time Traveller's Guide to Elizabethan England. The book's pretty good. There is also a TV series on that. And that brings into something to be said around using film to engage students and also to build that wider knowledge. It doesn't support the literacy in the same way that reading would, but it definitely does have a place. I think some of the books are accessible in the library. There are also, for some of the books, we've got PDF versions for quite a few books, which are shared with the boys as well. And then there's some books on our other two topics, so Germany and conflict there as well. And then with our year sevens and eights, we've got these two books that we've promoted. We've done a little bit more on these, in that we've got it ties into what I'm going to come on to in a minute, but we've got a history reading club where we provided books for some boys, targeting pupil premium boys, and particularly high prioritizing pupil premium boys. Because there's some research that showed that at a certain age, I think it's by year 7 or late year 7, boys start to turn off reading who are from more disadvantaged backgrounds, even if they've shown an aptitude for it before that. So we try and sort of capture that and capture their sort of passion for reading. Mr. Cross, who's our head of faculty, used to run a Friday sort of book club where the boys would sit with them and read. And then this book here, Shashi Tharoor's Inglorious Empire, is a fantastic book about the British Empire, particularly in India. And we don't give them the book, but we use extracts from the book to look at. And that's really, really powerful for the boys because it shows them sort of historical scholarship as well. And we use that alongside sort of, I think, different historians. Niall Ferguson's the one that comes to mind, who show a completely different sort of point of view. And that's quite powerful because it builds into that idea and that historical skill that they need at GCSE about historical interpretations. So it's trying to build that reading in. And then looking in at sort of that love of learning, the way that we can promote a broader balanced curriculum is trying to look at the curriculum, looking at what can we do that is extracurricular and supercurricular. So, you know, having a book, we've got a book club, and so some of these at the moment we're not doing because of COVID, but these are things that we were doing last year. So a book club, a film club, a debate club that we run with the English department. There's a Twitter program at the moment with Ask a Historian, and there's also historians are doing some webinars and things like that. We haven't managed to tap into that, but I know a number of the schools have, where they can ask historians or an expert on a topic, something like that. And it helps them sort of build that confidence. And a lot of these people, again, are on Twitter, especially now that there's COVID, they haven't got anything else to do. So it's a good time to sort of hit them up and say, would you be willing to spend half an hour just answering some questions on the Mughal Empire for our Year 8 boys? And that's something that we're aiming to do. Looking at historical, local history, if you can, doing school trips, again, it depends on your context, and what you can do is it depends on your context. But where I've run trips in the past, it makes a huge difference to engagement, confidence, and also that passion for learning. And if you can, historical competitions. So the Historical Association runs lots of competitions. Some of them are writing, some of them are other things as well. And now all of these things that I'm asking you to do require a lot of subject knowledge. And I think the hardest part for us over the last few years of changing our curriculum has been developing that subject knowledge. It's enjoyable, you get to learn about history, but it is hard to do. I'm also aware that our context is very different. We've got 6 history teachers, 4 of them are specialists that went to Russell Group universities and studied history either in the whole of their degree or part of their degree. And I know that's not available to everyone. And so the way you sort of overcome that is find people who are and get them to help you out. So something that we've done is in-department CPD. So this is a CPD I led to the Department of the Mughal Empire. My colleague Samir did this CPD on Nazi Germany. And one of the things he told us was that is the idea of fake news. So we always see fake news being associated with Donald Trump, but actually Hitler would accuse people of having fake news in it. There was a term that he used called Lügenpresse, which literally translates as fake news. There's the Historical Association as well, which have got lots of resources. They've got a journal that comes out called, there's a secondary history one called Teaching History. There's lots of different ideas around teaching history throughout that. They come out every quarterly, and you can also get a backlog of the digital ones. You can just search whatever you're looking for. That's what we've signed up to this year, is the Prince's Teaching Institute. And they hold lots of webinars and seminars on teaching and how to improve. Some comments in chat. Sites that I would recommend, it depends. So we use GCSE Pod, which works for our exam board, but we buy into that. Otherwise, there's things like Bite Size. There's things like it's just when you get asked something, your mind goes blank. There are lots of websites out there. BBC Teach are good as well for some of the courses. But with things like that, I think sometimes you have to write some questions for students to answer as well. But yeah, I'm just going to rattle through, because I know I've talked a lot, and there's a few other things that you might want to know about. So these are some other questions when you're thinking about the implementation of your curriculum. What should you consider? Looking at sort of like the impact. So there's another element. So what are your assessment outcomes? What's the short-term impact? What's the longer-term impact? How are you adapting to the student needs? And if Ofsted come and inspect, they'll be looking generally at a trend as well. So they'll be looking at your results over a period of 3 years. They'd want to track your data. They might also look at the attainment of different groups. So for us, when we had our Ofsted inspection, they didn't deep dive history, deep dive geography. But something that they requested was all our SEN, or a number of our SEN history books to look at. So looking at how were we delivering our curriculum to them, but they didn't deep dive that subject. And then sort of look at how are students going on, impacting on their life with your history curriculum. And then looking at the impact, there's some things to consider there as well. I'm not going to go through preparing for Ofsted, just because I know that you've had deep dives in other subjects, and this would just be the same as what they would say to you. Things that you might need to consider when you're looking at your self-audit are the ideas of so your context. I would say if you're trying to redo your curriculum, I would also be conscious of the fact that you've given yourself enough time to do so, and that there's quality of education, that you've got breadth and balance at Key Stage 3. Things you need to also think about is how we adapted your Key Stage 3 curriculum so it provides a strong foundation for GCSE. There's on the Key, if you've got access to the Key for school leaders, there's a whole model audit which will help you sort of do self-audit of history, and it's looking at things like what proportion of teachers who deliver history are subject specialists, and it's got some sort of potential answers, some things for you to potentially consider. So I'm just trying to get through a lot of this. How adequate is your students' breadth and depth of knowledge, and how can you expand that? So I think we've talked about some ways you could possibly do that, but also how are you getting them to embed that knowledge? What sort of key skills are you giving the students? So yeah, I think we're pretty done for time. Is there any other questions that you'd like me to answer quickly?
Jazakallah khair, Harris. If there's any other questions that do come through, I think what we'll try and do is we'll try and kind of capture them outside of this session, just conscious of the time.
Yeah,
so just to summarize, if I can, the YouTube link, inshallah, will be shared with everybody post-event, as will the slide deck and the post-event kind of evaluation. any links, and I know Harris, thanks a lot for sharing an abundance of kind of links and resources. One of the things I am going to hold you to is just share with me some of those links if I've missed any, so we can capture that over email, and then I'll share that with the group. But yeah, from myself, a very interesting session, Harris. Thanks for making it interactive. I think you've done a great job getting everybody involved. And I think the group thoroughly enjoyed the session. So on behalf of the AMS, thank you, and Jazakallah khair for
thank you to all of you guys as well. It's very difficult when you're just talking to a screen, and I can't actually see anyone's face as well. So I was relying on the chat a little bit. Otherwise, it feels like you're just talking to yourself for an hour and a half. But yeah, so that really thank you for your contributions as well.
No problem, no problem. I'm sure there's some really nice words that have been said in the group chat by the participants to you in particular. So yes, I'm going to bring the session to an end. Jazakallah khair for everybody for attending. Just one final thing from myself, if I can. And Harris, I'm just going to look at you just to tell me that you can see my screen. Harris, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
So upcoming webinars, just to remind everybody, 2 upcoming webinars. These are the last 2 of the 8 webinar series. Send Best Practice this coming Friday, and the next week, Mental Health and Wellbeing. Just to let everybody know, the Send and Best Practice have an enormous amount of registration so far. I think the last time I checked this afternoon, Send was close to something like 220, and Mental Health and Wellbeing was close to 300. So there's an enormous amount of interest in these 2 topics, and I would highly encourage you, if you haven't registered, jump onto the website ams-uk.org/training, get registered, get onto it, because I think it's going to be an amazing an event. So on behalf of everybody from the AMS, Jazakallah khair. Thanks again, Harris. I really appreciate you giving up your afternoon and evening. So I'll bring the session to a close. Thanks a lot. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.